I'm very glad to be here and opening up our week of interesting conversations. I want to start low dimensional, and then go high dimensional in this talk and show you how some of the things that we've been looking at in low dimensional spaces carry over to high dimensional spaces. And I'm very excited to talk with you later about ways that we could analyze the high dimensional spaces, which introduce some interesting new challenges to what we've been looking at. I come from a cognitive science and psychology and computational mechanisms background, and that's what this talk is going to be framed as. There will be a nod to a mathematical theorem in there at some point. Stay tuned for that. But otherwise, it's going to be about the behavior mostly of people and how we can understand that behavior with models. And therefore, given that we have a very wide range of backgrounds in here, I'm very happy to take questions, comments as we go along, at least up until the point where the time pressure towards the end of the talk means that I will stop those questions and proceed at a gallop to get through the rest of the stuff in my talk. All right, so here we go. This button. Great. I'm going to start with the punchlines from this talk so that at least you have all those things in your mind and can take those away. First, search is going to be the kind of behavior and cognition that I'm talking about here today. And I hope to convince you that search underlies a lot of what we consider to be intelligent behavior, partly because search is what is very useful for navigating structured environments that organisms live in. That is the wrong button. There we go. One of the kinds of structured environments that I'm going to be focusing on today is ones in which there are resources that are distributed in a patchy manner, where there's clumps of resources in some parts of the space, not resources in other parts, and the organism that is navigating that landscape needs to find those clumps of resources. And that can be done efficiently by trading off global search to find a patch with local search to focus within the patch and find the resources there. And that is adaptively balancing between, well, first exploration in the global search to find patches, and then exploitation of patches using local search. That combination of exploitation and exploration I will talk about as foraging, and it maps on very closely to what animals do when they are foraging for food, as we'll see. People do this kind of exploration, exploitation, back and forth search in low dimensional spaces, physical space, and also in high dimensional spaces that are characterized, for instance, by information sources out in the world or information in our own minds. So we're going to be talking about how people search within their own memories as well. Got that button again. And I will leave us all with some of the open questions, which are the things that I'd love to talk with you more about, in particular about how we can understand these processes that people are using, and animals, and large language models, and other forms of AI to achieve intelligent search. Okay, that's what we're doing. Oh, man. It's going to be a learning experiment also to see how many times I press the wrong button. You can count and see if they spread out over time as they should. All right. We're here for 3 months, many of us talking about intelligence and how to understand it with mathematics. What do I mean by intelligence? One answer is the idea of ecological rationality, and that is, how do organisms that are in particular environments capitalize on the structure of those environments with structures in their minds to achieve adaptive behavior, intelligent adaptive behavior. That's what we call ecological rationality. It's the fit between the mind and environment, structures in the mind and structures in the environment, that enables and yields intelligent behavior, intelligent decision-making in that particular environment. It's achieved by decision mechanisms, which often are very simple, that are adapted to the challenges that the entity, organism faces in its environment. And those environment structures themselves also get made and shaped in part through the action of those agents operating in the environment. Like when organisms eat the food that they find in patches, they change the structure of that environment, often making it even more patchy, for instance. So there's this overall principle going on in ecological rationality about environments that, through evolution and learning, select and shape minds that themselves select and shape the environments that they are going to do well in, that they can behave intelligently in. Our research group at Max Planck Institute in Germany did a lot of work on this. There's a number of books that you can look at to find out more about these things. I'm going to be focusing today, as I have been for some years, on the particular aspect of intelligent behavior summed up in search. And we also have a book out on that a few years ago, Cognitive Search, Evolution, Algorithms, and the Brain. And search is a key challenge for intelligent agents to solve. Search is needed whenever there are resources that the agent is needing to use or wanting to use that are not all immediately available to it. That is, those resources are distributed in space and or time. Whenever that is the case, then the agent must engage in search to find those sources of resources. What kind of resources does that apply to? Food, animals foraging, for instance, or looking for water, other sources of energy, looking for places to live, looking for social partners of various kinds, mates, friends, collaborators, looking for non-material things in the world like information. That could be external, could be internal. As I mentioned before, searching in memory, searching for innovations in some problem space or solutions in some problem space. And we modern humans have created even more things that we can spend our time searching for. Buying houses, finding jobs, different kinds of consumer goods that we might look for, or things like entertainment, what movie to watch, what music to listen to, meaning in life. Not going to answer all these questions today. Happy to talk about them more, though. So, all of those things can happen, those resources can be distributed in an environment according to various kinds of patterns. One kind of pattern, as I mentioned, that I'm going to focus on is patchiness. Things, all these resources, can be together or apart in an environment. And we can then define patches in terms of some distance that we can measure between the things and where or when they occur. So we can talk, of course, about low-dimensional physical spaces and have stuff that is, in some cases, some of the instances are close together, and some of the instances are further apart from each other. That's physical spaces and patches. We can have high-dimensional spaces, like in our minds, where some concepts may be close together. So duck and chicken may feel close somehow to lots of people, have a low distance between them, whereas duck and spoon may be much further apart, but spoon and key and door in this particular instance are perhaps closer together to people. So there could be clusters of animal concepts in mind and clusters of household objects together in mind, but those are separate from each other and so would constitute patches. We can also think about patches in time, where things, if we have time here and how often the thing being looked for is occurring here, if something happens a whole lot, like maybe kelp washing up on the beach at high tide and a bird looking for things to eat through the kelp, there would be patches in time, but always happening at the same location in space. So that's another kind of patch that organisms can have ways of adaptively searching for. And one of the things that we have been looking at is how similar kinds of search strategies can apply to patchy environments across these different kinds of spaces, low-dimensional spaces and high-dimensional spaces. And in fact, search underlies intelligence, I think, so strongly that if we think of life forms that don't engage in search, we probably think they don't have a whole lot of intelligence. Like these sea pens that sit on the ocean floor and all of the resources that they need come to them. And all they have to do is just wait and wave their fronds around and capture the food that they need, capture the sex cells that they need to reproduce, and that's their life. And they're not doing a lot of intelligent thinking while they're sitting there waiting for that stuff to float by. Another way that we can see that search is an important challenge for intelligent agents is the effort that intelligent agents go to avoid having to do search. We try to figure out and succeed in figuring out a lot of ways of making it so that we don't even have to search around for the consumer goods that we want and go to the store and try to buy them. We were just talking this morning about the frustration of going to CVS and all of the things that you want to buy are behind locked doors now, which leads to solutions like, I just want to sit at home, search online, and have all those things sent to me instead. Search is a problem that we are always looking for ways to overcome. And we're not alone. Ants also look for ways that they can reduce their search challenges. So cataglyphous desert ants that live in fairly featureless landscapes, there are some landmarks that they can look for, but if they are in a particularly flat area, they can't see those landmarks from very far away. And so what they do is build mounds that they can climb up on and survey from atop this super high 3-centimeter mound and see the things around them so that they don't have to go and search for the insects that have died nearby. They can just see them and head directly towards them. So what do animals have to do when they are facing patchy environments? There's 3 main sort of steps to whatever search strategy they might be employing. First of all, they have to find a resource patch. They do that by exploring. How they explore is something that needs to be filled out within this particular rough sketch of an algorithm. Once they have found a resource patch, they need to stay with it and harvest it, use it up, until such time as they have used up most of it and it is going to be more appropriate to leave that patch and go on and find something new. As long as they are staying there and using that patch, that's the exploitation phase. But as I mentioned, at some point they need to make the decision to leave this patch and go and find another patch, usually because they have used up the current patch that they are in, or maybe others who are also foraging at the same time have used up that patch. And so the resources that are available there may be all gone or may be difficult to find the rest of them. And at some point, the organism needs to decide, okay, I need to leave here, switch from exploiting, go back to exploring. One way of doing that is a general category of ways of doing that is called area-restricted search. In area-restricted search, I'll show you in just a second, when an organism finds a patch, then it takes small steps to stay in that local area, to restrict its search to a local area. When the patch gets used up, then it switches to longer steps that will take it away from that patch and hopefully towards another patch. And that's how it navigates back and forth between local search and global search. So for example, if this bird is looking for grubs that are hidden in a field and can't see them from far away, it can first of all start by exploring, taking big steps and sampling to see, is there a grub here? Is there a grub here? No. Grub here? No. Is there a grub here? Yes. What that video just showed and is now gone. As soon as it finds a grub somewhere, then it switches from its exploration mode, where it's taking large steps, mostly in a forward direction, to an exploitation mode, where it is taking smaller steps and making sharper turns so that those small sharp turn steps will keep it in roughly the area where it had first found those resources. And as long as it continues finding resources, those grubs under the ground in that area, it will continue to have those short steps with high angle turns. If it fails to find some grubs, then it will switch back to the exploration mode, head off, and hopefully encounter another patch somewhere else. So that's the area restricted search. This is the part where the search is being restricted to the local area where the resources have been found. And we see how the individual is able to go back and forth between those two kinds of modes of behavior. We have a few people here who are interested in intelligence in unicellular organisms, and this kind of behavior is also seen in them. Frighteningly, in malaria, amongst other kinds of parasites, the malaria stage of life that is infecting a new mammal host engages in switching back and forth between super diffusive tissue exploration to find a blood vessel. That's what it wants to do, is get into blood vessels so that it then can be carried quickly to the places where it wants to go. And once it finds a blood vessel, subdiffusive local vessel exploitation, looking for a way to get into that blood vessel and then be carried elsewhere in the body.
Yeah, so in what sense would you say is what motivates the search in these different organisms different, or in what ways is it similar?
The motivation is to find whichever resource it is that it needs to find. And that need could be built in through evolution. It could be developed by learning. It could be something that humans are controlling themselves and deciding, here is the thing that I want to find. I want to find rare issues of this old Batman comic, and that's what I'm going to spend my lifetime searching for. Not me.
Just maybe I can clarify. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking more like, so for example, in cognitive science, there's a lot of different theories, what underlies search, or like what motivates search. For example, there is evidence that it might be maximizing learning progress or information gain or surprise minimization. So does any of that also kind of like translate into what you're talking about?
So those more general kinds of motivations often apply to an organism that is not looking for a particular resource, but rather is exploring the environment in order to find out more about that environment, how to navigate that environment, and to find out what is there in the environment. So I think those kinds of motivations also would absolutely fit in here, but they usually would not be the things that are leading to this more directed exploration, exploitation kind of search. I think once there's a goal that has been found and the way that that goal thing, substance is distributed in the environment is patchy, then this kind of an algorithm would be appropriate. Thanks, good question. All right. So here are some examples of humans doing that kind of patchy search as well. First of all, looking over on this side, here we just set up a very simple experiment where people are moving a little ship around on a two-dimensional screen. There have been rewards, gold doubloons hidden in patches in this space, and people are looking for them by moving the ship around. And when they do that, you see, so the gray areas are the places where the resource is actually hidden. And you can see that this person got super lucky, started here, only explored a little bit, and then found a patch and exploited it, then left that patch, was exploring in a very straight manner, found another patch, stayed there for a long time, and then switched back to exploring. And that's what people do when they are in a patchy environment. They might not even know initially that they're in a patchy environment, but once they figure it out, they switch to that. In contrast to a diffuse environment where the resource has been spread evenly across that space, you see very different, more space-filling kind of behavior going on. So it's not switching back and forth between exploration and exploitation, because that would not be useful here. So in this case, a different kind of search is being used. Again, what we're focusing on today is the environments that are patchy. And patches, again, are dense areas of resources, like could be berries on a bush that a bird is looking for. The patches could vary in how large they are, how much resources are. They could also all be similar size, and that leads to different kinds of strategies, as we'll see. And not only must the patches be found, but the resources within them have to be found also, so that there is local search that's required. It's not just you get everything as soon as you show up to a local patch. Okay? And so the basic problem to be solved is the animal should take into account how much resource is left here in this local patch that I've been looking in already, how much resource is elsewhere in the environment, and is this a good time to leave and go find another patch, or should I stay here and continue to look in this patch for resource that might be left? How do organisms make that kind of a decision? We will talk about that after we see what could they be approaching in an optimal sense. What is optimal in these kinds of settings is for an organism to leave a patch when you would get less resource over time if you stayed in the patch than if you left the patch and looked for other patches. That's Charnov's marginal value theorem, which underlies the field of optimal foraging theory in biology. And more technically, there's the theorem, by the way. Leave when instantaneous rate of return falls to the mean rate of return in the environment. Right? Please.
Is there any concept of risk aversion in these considerations? Staying where you are involves less risk, right? So, or is it just an issue of maximizing expectations?
So within optimal foraging theory framework, lots of other things also get added in to make the modeling more realistic, and risk aversion is absolutely one of them. With the risk aversion, it can be risk aversion to predators that might be out there as you're exploring and trying to get from one patch to another. It can also be risk aversion in that the distribution of sizes of patches might be very variable, and so you might not want to face that variability and rather stay with something longer that you know you will be able to get, or more likely able to get. So absolutely, risk aversion can figure in here. I'm not including that in what we're talking about today, but it absolutely does fit in. Okay. This calculation of what is my immediate rate of return and what is the mean rate of return in the entire environment might not be things that the organism can actually determine or know exactly. And so what is often seen is that different organisms use different kinds of approximations of this calculation to figure out when should they leave a patch. We're going to be focusing on this patch leaving decision in particular for a little while in the rest of the talk. So what do some of those approximations or simple heuristics look like? One is a decremental rule. All of these are going to be framed in terms of how long the organism has been on the patch. So it arrives at the patch here. And then as time proceeds, where these X's are, that's when it is finding individual items in that patch. And on the y-axis is the tendency to stay. So if the tendency to stay is very high, it's going to stay in the patch. As it falls to some low threshold, when its tendency to stay gets low enough, that's when it will leave the patch. And so this is one way of looking at a trace in this basically two-dimensional landscape, is how is its tendency to stay changing over time, and when would we predict that it's going to leave a patch. So if an organism is following a decremental rule, it comes to a patch with a high tendency to stay. If it doesn't find anything, so in this period of time, its tendency to stay just falls gradually. If it finds something, then it drops its tendency to stay. I found something, so now I'm going to become more likely to leave. Its tendency to stay falls again gradually. In between finding another object, it finds another object, and its tendency to stay falls again. Then doesn't find anything for a while, and then it finds another thing, and its tendency to stay falls and hits that threshold, and then it leaves the patch. So that's one kind of simple rule. Every time you find something in the patch, get more likely to leave the patch. And that's the opposite of an incremental rule, which the tendency to stay falls while nothing has been found, but as soon as something is found, its tendency to stay increases. So it will stay longer in the patch, and then falls again, increases, falls again, increases later, falls again, and at some point hits the threshold, and again it leaves. So two opposite kind of rules that organisms have been seen to use. Why would that happen? I'll show you in just a second. It comes down to differences in the structure of the environment. These kinds of structures of behavioral rules in mind are matched to particular kinds of structures in the organism's environment. Another variation, which is commonly seen in patch leaving rules, is called an a giving up time rule. And that is like the incremental rule in that every time something is found, the tendency to stay increases, but it always increases to the same level. What that does is effectively makes it so that the rule is basically operating in terms of a giving up time. As soon as it's been this amount of time or longer, or rather, let's just say this amount of time that I've been in the patch and haven't found anything, then I will leave. So that's a very simple kind of rule. You're there looking for stuff in a particular patch, and if it has been too long since the last thing that you found, then you leave. Two other simple kinds of rules that organisms can use to leave a patch. One is after you find a fixed number of things in the environment. This now, the y-axis is the number of items that have been found. And after a certain number of them have been found, then the organism leaves. We'll see when that kind of rule is also useful. And then a fixed time rule, which is as soon as a time barrier is hit, then the organism leaves. Okay, all these different rules, and they are useful in different kinds of situations for making an approximation of what the marginal value theorem predicts would be optimal behavior. These are the different environment structures where those different rules work. If all the patch sizes are roughly equal, there's the same number of items roughly in each patch, then use a decremental or a fixed number rule that basically is counting, have I gotten to what I expect the number of things in this patch is going to be, and when I get to or close to that number, then it's a good time to leave. If the patch sizes are random, then if you find a new item, it doesn't tell you anything about the size of that patch, and so a fixed time rule, always leave after a certain amount of time, is most appropriate. If the patches vary widely in how many items they have in them, in their size, with some patches having a lot of items in them, then if you get into a good patch, you want to stay in that patch as long as you can to use up all those items and not have to switch and face the risks and the time costs of exploring. And in that case, a giving up time rule or an incremental rule is good. The more things you find, the longer you stay in the patch. So that is how we see this match between what's going on in the minds of the organisms and how the environment is structured, fitting together to create adaptive and intelligent behavior. If you use the wrong rule in the environment that you're facing, it would lead to wasted time. If you, for instance, used a fixed number rule in an environment where some of the patches didn't have that number of items that you're waiting for, then you could end up being in a patch and just waiting for, I know there's got to be 10 items here, but if there aren't, you would stay there too long and waste time that you could be looking elsewhere for the resource, for instance. Sure.
So looking across species, are different species characterized typically, I mean, whatever, in a gross overgeneralization by, a single one of these search strategies? Or are they able to flexibly switch between them if they're foraging on different resources or if their environment changes?
Yeah, great question. There's some evidence of each of those kinds of patterns. So some organisms seem to primarily use one particular kind of rule in their environment. There have been some instances of finding organisms that can adapt which kind of rule they're using when their environment structure changes, like different with seasonality and availability of the resources they're looking for. Yeah. And also, we were very interested in whether people are able to switch what kind of rule they're using depending on the environment they face. And you will stay tuned to see the results of that. Here's how we studied how people decide when to leave particular patches, what kind of patch leaving rule they use. By setting up a simple fishing game in the lab where people came in and they were controlling a little fisher guy who would walk over to a pond. There's some number of fish in the pond. Every once in a while, a fish appears at the surface of the pond and you move your hook to catch that fish, which is not hard. And then the fish goes into your bucket. And this is all the fish that you have caught so far. And this is added up across ponds because at any point, the person can say, I'm done with this pond. I'm going to hit the big red next pond button. That's what it says in German, neuer Teich, and go off to another pond where they don't have to do the exploration for it. Their little guy just walks over to another pond after a certain amount of time. The fewer fish that there are in the pond, the longer it takes randomly for the next fish to appear on the top. So the time between fish expands as there are fewer fish in the pond. And so we can look at people's behavior in here and figure out what kind of patch leaving rule are they using. Said all that. We made 3 kinds of environments in terms of the distribution of fish across ponds. Oh, I should say a couple other things. People would do this for like 45 minutes or an hour. They didn't know how long it was going to last exactly, and we didn't let them have a watch or timepiece with them so that they couldn't be cheating and looking at, okay, it's been 30 seconds, I'm going to leave. And the more fish that they caught, the more they got paid, so they were incentivized to find as many fish with whatever strategy they could within this time. Each person faced a different distribution of fish across all the ponds that they would come to. There was one environment where there was a low variability. This is a histogram of the ponds and the number of fish in each pond. So this first environment, most of the ponds had 10 fish in them, and a quarter had 9 fish in them. This was a normally distributed distribution of fish across ponds, and this is a long-tail distribution of fish across ponds, so that there are a few ponds that are really good and lots of ponds that are just middling with a few fish in them. And as I just laid out before, we expected, or we at least knew that if people used these different rules, they would have better performance in each of those particular kinds of ponds. And so then we got traces of their behavior in this environment. Another way to look at how people are navigating this kind of environment is to look at what they are doing over time. And so each of these is from one person who has faced a number of ponds in their experimental session, blowing up on one particular person's behavior. We have a number of fish that have been caught here, and, oh, sorry, we have time here, a number of fish that have been caught here. Okay, so this is time in seconds. And each pond that they go to is represented by a blue line on this plot. So for the top blue line, the person caught a fish right away and then didn't catch any fish for a while, caught another fish, didn't catch any, caught another one, no fish for a while, caught another one, etc. All the way up to here, and the black star indicates where they decided, okay, I want to go to the next pond. And what we want to look at then is that pattern of when they are leaving a pond, making those patch leaving decisions, and how can we characterize what rule they are using. Looking at the best fitting lines for each person's behavior across multiple ponds. If we saw in here a line that goes straight up, then that indicates that they could have been using a fixed time rule. When this person got to 500 seconds, they often left the pond. Again, they don't have timepieces with them, so they're approximating this. A decreasing line indicates that the more fish they caught, the more likely they were to leave the pond. And that is a decremental rule. We don't see very many of those, but there's one that looks like that. In general, what we see is that there's an increasing trend such that the longer or the more fish people had caught, the longer they're staying in the pond. And that indicates an incremental rule or a giving up time rule. And we then analyzed people's behavior in more detail and indeed found that what best explained their behavior was leaving a pond when it had been too long since the last fish that they caught. And you might feel this in yourself if you've been fishing or waiting for other things to happen. It's been too long, I'm out of here, gonna find another opportunity.
Do you expect the same result if the reward was a continuous value rather than a discrete? So like if you look for some resources that are along a gradient, right, as you search the gradient, you get more and more reward if you climb the gradient correctly or not.
Right, right.
Would you expect the same type of strategy in this case?
As long as the rewards are also going to go down again. So if it's a gradient that you search to and then you get to the top of it and you just keep on getting that higher amount of reward there, then this kind of rule would not apply. But if you are depleting that resource, then yes, this kind of strategy with some appropriate kind of leaving rule would apply. And it would then depend more on how rich are the local...
The principle is the same whether the reward is discrete or continuous.
It should be, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, so that does get looked at in some other species like spiders that are capturing prey and then sucking the life juices out of them. That's a continuous reward, but at some time, they're sucking and just not getting as much, and they have to decide, should I keep on trying to get more juice out of this one, or should I go and catch another one?
I'm more thinking of bacteria walking around.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And they're often using simple run and tumble strategies that are approximations of this as well. Yeah. Good question. All right. So it looks like how people are fishing in these ponds, these patches that we have set up for them, is that the longer the more fish they find, the more rewards they're getting, the longer they stay in that particular patch. And once it's been too long since the last thing that they caught, then they move on to another patch. This is this simple giving up time heuristic, as I said. And yeah. One of the interesting aspects, though, is that people use that strategy no matter what environment structure we put them in. So even when they were in the environment structure where all the ponds had the same number of items, fish in them, they still used this kind of strategy. There's various reasons why that might be. One of them that I think is important is that it's hard to know what kind of environment structure you're in if you are controlling when you are leaving and moving from one patch to another. So if you don't have some other source of information, and if you have high priors that you're going to be in a kind of environment where there's that aggregated distribution with a long tail of patch sizes, then using that giving up time rule is an appropriate strategy. Jacob, what is my timing?
I think since we've been going back and forth and we started 5 minutes late, you can go for another, I don't know, like 18 minutes.
Great.
Including the questions.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. Okay. All right, so that was external, two-dimensional, spatial environments. External information environments are also things that people navigate. I'm going to just go through this quickly so that we get to the internal information environments. But information outside of us is also distributed in patches, like in libraries, like in other people's heads, like in journal articles, in groups of web pages online. And people also appear to use area-restricted search for this kind of information search too. I'm just going to, if you want to know more about that, information foraging theory by Peter Paroli and Stu Card is where a lot of this has been laid out and looked at. This was done in the 1990s and early 2000s largely. And so actually the structure of the web has changed such that those area-restricted strategies may not work as well anymore. And we're going, or at least search companies are trying to even help us get away from search. Again, back to what I was saying before, eliminate the problem of search by just finding what people want or telling them what they want without them having to engage in a search process. I'd be very happy to talk with anybody who's interested in another kind of space that people spend a lot of time looking through, which is music space and other kinds of cultural artifacts. We've done a bit of work on this. The music space, in terms of bands at least, is, and other musical groups, is patchy. People listen to clumps of different kinds of artists. And so we can look at how people navigate that space over time. We have done that. This is not us doing that. This is just a visualization of what kinds of things we've been looking for. If you have a whole bunch of different kinds of music genres and you have records of things that people are listening to over long periods of time, which you can get from online music streaming services, then you can look to see, do people start in one little patch that's around uplifting trance and then get bored of that over time and go over to New School breaks and then don't like that, keep on going to Dutch House, and then that's the patch that they stay in for a while. Do people do that, or do they hop around randomly, or do they just stay in one place for their whole lives? That kind of foraging is also something that we can look at. But I'm happy to talk with people more about that later too. Now looking at internal environments, and we will get to the high-dimensional space. Well, the music space is definitely high-dimensional already too, but this will stay high-dimensional. Looking at whether things that people think about, ideas and concepts, innovations, are those clustered in our minds or not? If they are, do we search for and amongst these internal information patches in a way that we can understand? And is it similar or not similar to how we search in low-dimensional spaces? So we have been studying this for a while, looking at how people search within their own minds, often using a very simple task that's called the verbal fluency task, or sometimes the semantic fluency task. And that task you all get to engage in right now. We are going to do it. Tell me all of the animals that you can think of. Go. Hawks? Fox.
Lemon, tiger,
Shark.
goldfish,
Goldfish. Panda. Great. Bear.
Sloth.
dinosaur,
Dinosaurs. Sloth.
triceratops,
cougar,
stegosaurus.
Okay. Excellent. This is a very varied group and many different species, some of which I've never even heard of are being proposed. Now we're done. Did you feel in your heads that you come up with a bunch of things and then you pause and then come up with some more things? That is the common experience. Excellent. But another part of the common experience which you guys did not participate in is that basically everybody starts with dog and cat or cat and dog, most people.
the normies.
Yeah, exactly. We're much more interesting. And then often people think of, some other pets, hamster maybe, ferret, if it wasn't a legal pet in your state, and then maybe pause for a minute and then think, what about goats and farm animals, chickens, cows, and come up with a few of those, and then pause for a minute, and then, sea animals, and then think of a whole bunch of those. So the production of these kinds of semantic concepts from memory looks like it is patchy. And so we've been exploring that. How are people navigating this space that seems to be patchy? And trying to figure out what the algorithms that people are using might be. So there are different kinds of traces. I'll show you different kinds of traces in this high dimensional space that people are navigating. One of the kinds of things that we can look at is how long does it take for a person to go from one word to another. So just, they said one word, they said the next word, how long was it in between? And when people are making a burst of words, that's characterized by a short amount of time, a short inter-item retrieval time between the words in that burst. When they pause and then start another burst, that pause is a longer IRT or inter-item retrieval time. Okay?
But do people think of the concept and then break it up to elements, or is this sort of is the concept implicit or explicit?
So, great question. Usually we have people, we prompt people with the concept that they should be thinking, like animals. And
but even within animals, do they first think pets and then think of the specific pets, or is that just implicit?
That's part of what needs to be figured out. Yeah. I think that it's a sort of combination of that. I think high frequency, like commonly thought about animals, come to mind easily. And then if people say a few of them, that puts them in a frame of mind of, okay, now I'm saying pets, are there other pets that come to mind? But that's part of what we need to figure out. Yeah, great question. Here's another way of visualizing the kinds of traces. Here we have time now laid out explicitly, and the similarity between the two consecutive words. And then we can see how people are moving around, at least in terms of the similarity between pairs of successive words. First word, in this case for this person, was indeed dog, and their second word was cat, which had a high similarity to dog according to the similarity metrics that we were using. And so it gets plotted up here. And then they quickly said hamster after that, which is a bit less similar to cat than dog and cat are to each other. Then they said rat, which is a little bit less similar to hamster as well. They said fish. For some reason, according to these similarity metrics, fish is more similar to rat than to hamster. So that's one of the weirdnesses that's going on, is how the similarity metrics are being made. I mean, these are all roughly the same amount of similar to each other. And things proceed. The other thing to note here is all of these yellow diamonds are places where the person said afterwards that they were switching. So we have people say this list of animals for 3 minutes, and we're furiously typing them down or transcribing them, and then we afterwards bring them over and say, here's the list that you made. Tell us where you think that you switched from one set of words to another set of words. And that's what these yellow dots are. So we're seeing their subjective indication of their switches. And one thing you can notice here is that a lot of times those subjective switches happen after relatively long pauses in their production. So they also felt like when they were pausing, they were moving to another patch.
I was curious, are they told that they were trying to get as many as possible, or?
Yes.
They,
yeah, so it's phrased as...
Interesting animals.
Nope, definitely not that. I mean, for this task, you can certainly do that too. And you can also say, tell us the most dissimilar set of animals you can come up with, which is super hard. So this is just name all the animals you can in 3 minutes.
Because that seemed like what the, I was trying to find animals that no one else had said.
That's great, exactly. And so this is, in fact, another kind of verbal fluency task. There are multi-player verbal fluency tasks. Usually it's done with 2 people, and like I say one, then you say one, and back and forth. And there, again, if the goal is say as many as you can, it's a very interesting coordination problem because something might come to mind for you that's pretty different from what the other person just said, but you don't necessarily want to throw them off track and they forget the cluster that they're in and can produce quickly. So that's another very interesting situation to model.
That's the sort of same thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So again, it's this, where people have these same sorts of pauses and they get frustrated in charades or something.
Exactly, and people model other of these games as well.
Especially the ones where you can pass.
Yeah, please.
When you say multidimensional, do you mean many patches? Or
No.
Each element has a lot of descriptions?
That. Yes. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. So high dimensional space here does not mean that there are many patches. It means that each item can be defined itself in a high dimensional space. And that's usually what is done for semantic concepts like this. Like the similarity metric that we are using here is cosine similarity on representations of words that have been developed by training on large corpora, and the representations of those words are over 100 dimensions each, where the dimensions are not necessarily interpretable. I'm going to proceed, because it's just going to get more interesting. All right, so do people use area-restricted search when they are doing this kind of a task? Are they switching when they are no longer being productive as they could be in this current patch? That's what the marginal value theorem would predict. We will look at that by looking at the inter-item retrieval times, like seeing how long they are pausing, and that is the inverse of their reward rate. The answer is yes, and you can see that here in this plot of where we have down here the position of words now normalized to this is the start of a new patch where somebody has said, or we have other ways of determining that they have switched to a new patch. How long did it take them to go from the previous word to this word? But that's represented as now the ratio of how long it took to their mean rate of how long it takes. So the average time that it takes them to go from one word to another. And again, this is the inverse of return rate. So here, higher values are worse. They're having worse performance because they're taking longer to get to the next word. And so what we see is that when they're in the middle of a patch, it's taking this amount of time, well, the ratio, to get to the next word, and that increases. They get slower and slower until they get to the point where they are switching to the next patch. And at that point, that IRT is longer than their mean IRT. And that's what the optimal foraging, the marginal value theorem would predict. People should switch when they have slowed down beyond the rate that they could expect to achieve if they kept searching elsewhere. So that was a nice result. That is what that says, blah, blah, blah. And then our further questions are, how are people actually doing this? How are they making this decision? And also, are they actually making a decision at all actively to switch? There have been random walk models of this process, which also produce some of similar looking patterns of when people would leave. And so we want to try to find other evidence that people are actually actively deciding when to switch, when they feel like they are running out of things to say in a particular patch. And to do that, we turn to fMRI studies of people doing this task in the magnet and look to see whether there were indications of brain activation in regions that are known to be responsible for switching behaviors at the points where people told us that they were actually making a switch. And that is also what we found in the hippocampus in a paper last year. So that gave us some more support for the idea that people are actively foraging in memory, not just taking a random walk across a network of concepts that are connected on the basis of their similarity, for instance. What does this tell us? This is interesting evidence that people are searching in a similar kind of way, at least at this algorithmic level, when they are searching internally for concepts in mind, as when they are searching for resources in space. What we still don't know is what the precise kinds of mechanisms are involved in making those patch leaving decisions, and also for doing the exploration of how do they decide where they're going to go to find the next patch. How the hippocampus implements them. Also, is semantic memory in human minds actually structured in a patchy way, or are we just seeing patches when people are producing these kinds of outputs? And we're also interested in how other intelligences search such spaces. I will show you in just a second. All of this comes down to needing to know when people are actually switching. And I just told you one way that we look at it, which is the subjective report. We ask people afterwards, did you switch here? They might not actually know, and they might be looking at that list of words and saying, a normal person would have switched here, so that's what I'm going to say I did. We also ask other people, where do you think somebody switched in this list? And then we have other ways, like distance-based measures that are based on similarity, like cosine similarity. If the cosine similarity between a pair of words drops below what it was before and then rises again, that can be a signal that there was a switch from one patch to another patch. So we also look for those kinds of indications of switches. Which one is the best? We're not totally sure. One of the things that we have started to try is to use large language models, which also are, of course, based on large corpora, to see if they could help us with figuring this out. And the first thing that I did in that realm, and this is now we're going off into less understood territory, is ask ChatGPT to tell me all the animals it could come up with in 3 minutes. And it started coming up with a big list, which is very clumpy. It stopped after 157 animals, and that was in 30 seconds, which is less than 3 minutes. So it was just showing off I can do 3 minutes of human work in 30 seconds. It doesn't have a super good concept of time, of how long it's taking. But it produces way more than people do in 3 minutes. It's very patchy overall. Another thing that's interesting, it does not start with dog and cat. And in fact, it takes it 150 other animals before it gets around to mentioning dog and cat, which I thought was interesting. So I asked, well, what do you think a person would say if I gave a person this task? And then it starts with dog and cat, which is pretty remarkable, I thought. And I asked it, okay, explain yourself. Why did you give these two different sets of animals? And it said, well, I started my list with lion, tiger, elephant because those are easily recognizable animals that came to mind, my ChatGPT's mind, quickly. For the average person's list, I started with dog, cat, elephant, because dogs and cats are pets and elephants are iconic animals that come quickly to puny human minds. And so that quickly come to mind part is part of the aspect of the exploration part of this process. Like as Espen was asking about, how do you get from one place to another? One of the things that we think of is that people explore the space by saying animals that come quickly to mind. And ChatGPT seems to agree. We can also use GPT to analyze GPT and to tell us where it thinks that it or people made patch switches. So that's something that we are doing. Oh, no. Okay, there's part, I put in a slide and it didn't appear, but I do want to mention this. This issue of similarity is something that we are still trying to figure out. And as I was alluding to before, I think that what is interesting is that you can see when people do this, that they sometimes produce quite long sort of fluid patches that start in one place and end up somewhere totally different. Like they might say dog, cat, mouse, rat, pigeon, cockroach, because rats and pigeons are vermin and cockroach is also vermin. And if I think of cockroach, then I think of earwig because it's another insect. And then I might think of earworm because I don't actually know what are animals and aren't animals, but some things get into the list that way. And people can do that very fluently, not jumping from like mammals to birds to insects, but making these steps that look like they are collapsing that high-dimensional space down to maybe 1 or 2 dimensions. They started with pets, and they got from mouse to rat to pigeon, and then that collapsed them down to rat and pigeon are similar because they're vermin, and now I'm looking at the vermin dimension and then thinking of things that are similar in terms of the vermin dimension, and then I get to cockroach, and now I'm in insects, and now I'm squashing the high-dimensional space down perhaps to the invertebrate dimension and starting to think of things that are similar that way. So that kind of projection of the multidimensional space, the high-dimensional space, onto a low dimension where then these explore-exploit strategies can be applied in a simpler way perhaps, is one of the things that I'm very interested in exploring and would love to talk with you all more about. And that is basically what it says on this slide, and I will finish there. Thank you.